I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Ottawa City Planning Commission. Would you call the roll?
Member Kane.
Here.
Member Vice Chair Crowley.
Here.
Member Stresnick Dean. Here. Member Harris.
Here.
Chair Lantis.
Here.
Member Maxwell.
Here. All right, consent agenda, the August 14th, 2024 meeting minutes. We have any additions or corrections? Hearing none, do I hear a motion for approval? So moved. Second. Motion and a second. All in favor say aye. At this time, I would like to ask the Planning Commission members to make a declaration of any conflict of interest or of any ex parte or outside communication that might influence their ability to hear all sides on any item on the agenda so that they might come to a fair decision. Hearing none, we'll move on to item 5, new business, rezone application located at 132 South Mulberry Street, submitted by Van Knight Homes on behalf of the owner, Billy Watts. Zach, you're up.
I do have a presentation. I'm not sure why the PowerPoint's not up, so one moment.
There it comes, or something's coming up.
Okay. Is it on all your?
We have it on our screen,
I'll
so
go ahead and
yeah.
get going then.
Okay.
So again, this is an application for a rezone at 132 South Mulberry Street from I-1 light industrial to R1 low density residential, as requested by Slade Van Venter on behalf of Billy J. Watts. So the subject site is a, excuse me, a currently undeveloped 0.26 acre site located along the western side of South Mulberry Street. It is surrounded by a mix of vacant and developed parcels with a mixture of zoning. To the east, north, and south are vacant parcels zoned I-1, and to the west are 2 parcels zoned R2 on which a church is built. And then the wider area is generally residential in nature with several older built homes, as well as a very slight mix of industrial and commercial use, such as an existing warehouse at the corner of South Mulberry and East First Street. The applicant is requesting this rezoning to allow for the construction of a single-family home on the property, and this request would be in line with the historic use of the property and potentially serve as an impetus for larger rezoning and rehabilitation in that area. So on this slide, we have a overview of the area and the property in question. So you can see it is highlighted on the screen, and again, it is a currently vacant parcel, and there is a number of vacant parcels surrounding it. There is one other primary residential use on South Mulberry. You can see it on the top right hand side there. And then the only other use on that street beyond accessory buildings is again that aforementioned warehouse at the corner of East First and South Mulberry, which is not included in this image to capture everything else down here. Directly across the alleyway behind it, we have the Bethany Chapel Baptist Church and existing residential development on the neighboring street. And then to the southeast is generally just public use and that parkland to the southeast there. Here we can see the zoning of the surrounding area. Like I mentioned, that entire street is zoned light industrial. And then immediately across the alleyway, we have R2 medium density residential and then public use to the southeast. So this area has been developed in some way, shape, or form for well over 100 years now. The map that is shown on the screen here dates from 1924, and it does show existing homes along South Mulberry, as well as an earlier incarnation of the church that is on South Poplar, the Bethany Church, as well as numerous commercial and industrial uses north of East First Street, where that rail line used to go through. The property's current zoning does reflect the history of the neighborhood as well as the historical reality of industrial areas largely being along rivers and waterways, as well as access to the Missouri Pacific Railroad that originally ran in that area. Likely what occurred is this was kind of perceived future use of this area, and that zoning was slapped on it regardless of the housing that was existing there. However, even going back to 1975, our comprehensive plan from that date still shows this area as being single family in use. So while the zoning was placed on there, it never seems to have actually become anything more than maybe a light commercial area at best, and was largely residential in nature until the bulk of the homes along South Mulberry were destroyed. So in reviewing this, we have determined that the proposed use of a single-family home would be consistent with the intent and purpose of the proposed rezone. The subject lot, as well as surrounding lots, are of a size that is consistent with the intent of the R1 district and would allow for plenty of open space. The proposed rezoning would also conform to the intent of the zoning district in that it is located at the edge of a higher density and centrally located residential area, that R2 to the west. And then the area immediately surrounding the subject site is comprised of a mixture of uses, primarily being residential, but as well as public use and some commercial. Ages of the buildings vary, with homes having the widest range. There are some new builds there, as well as that relatively newer church building. And these developments are largely on the neighboring blocks, as there's one residential use on South Mulberry that I mentioned before, and a warehouse use at the corner of South Mulberry and East First. So the current zoning of the property is a detriment to future development, as the industrial zoning does prohibit residential uses, and the size of it does typically prohibit most industrial uses. It is the size of a residential lot and has historically been a residential use in a residential area. And excuse me. This rezoning would allow for additional housing to be built, and that would address that need that we have within the community, as well as our adopted goals and intent of the comprehensive plan. This application was provided for review by the city's DRC, and there was no concerns or comments regarding this proposed rezoning. And this item will be heard in the September 26, 2024 public hearing, at which time it will be recommended for further action. So with that, as I mentioned, it will be heard in a public hearing on September 26th, and at that time, the Planning Commission will be able to take further action. And there's no recommended action for the Planning Commission to take at this time, but it will take any questions or any requests for further research or background.
Questions?
Do you mind if I make a few comments on this neighborhood? So this was a historically Black neighborhood. And it was an area in the bottoms that was very, very heavily affected by flooding before flood control, which is why a lot of the houses are gone. The church actually, today is the anniversary of the dedication of the rebuild. It burned down 10 years ago this year, and then they rebuilt it and reopened it in 2016. So it's still part of that historically Black community. My question about this, though, I know there was an owner who tried to rezone a house on the street a few years ago. It was because they were trying to sell it, and it's hard to sell a residential house in an industrial area. And the city denied that a few years ago. That was, I think, 1115 South Mulberry. It was the house the Dials is owned, because they ended up, it became kind of an issue because it was harder to get a bank loan. So I'm concerned about like spot zoning this one property here. Do we need to look at if what we're seeing for this area is turning this into available residential land? Should we be looking at this as more of an area other than where there's already industrial to make that more palatable?
That is potentially an avenue we could look down. In my former city, we had a huge issue with this type of situation. St. Joe is a much older city than Ottawa, and it had a ton of areas that were zoned industrial for a variety of reasons that then had residential development, and they ran into the same issues you just mentioned, getting bank loans, being able to rebuild after disasters, things of that nature. So we actually did initiate many city rezonings. I did 4 or something like that during my time there, and there were at least 10 other neighborhoods that we were still working on addressing. That is something we can explore. It does require a fair bit more of outreach than an individual application. It requires the city to take on that task, essentially, of communicating with the neighbors and the owners of the property and assuming that they're wanting to be a part of that. It would, by technical definition, be a spot zoning, in the fact that it would be an isolated residential district in what is an existing industrial district. The area, as I mentioned, is largely vacant except for an already existing residential use that is non-conforming in an industrial area. And this is a down zone. We are removing the amount of intensity that would be allowed on this piece of property by bringing it to a residential standard instead of the industrial as it currently is. By and large, we do not see a lot of smaller industrial uses come before us. We sometimes see smaller commercial, things like animal kennels or something of that nature. But when it comes to what this property is zoned for, we don't get a lot of questions for things of this size. Lucas could likely speak a little bit more to that on some of the requests we do get through our office as far as size. This area is not that, and the historic use of the area, the context of it being a primarily black neighborhood, does give a little more feedback as to why it was likely changed to industrial zoning at some point. But that is, again, kind of reflective of the history of this property more than anything, which would lead to our recommendation of approval. We have maps showing that there were houses all up and down this street.
For sure.
And even as recently as 50 years ago, which has, that's 50 years after the initial map I showed you, it was still in use as single family, regardless of the zoning that they placed on there.
I think it's a good use of the space. I do know that the water in 2019 did go into Mulberry, but it didn't go as far as this property. But I don't have an issue with the rezoning. I'm just thinking about that whole area because I know that one house had been previously denied by a different group of people. But I don't know if that's ultimately something we do need to look at for that space if we want to see it developed.
Well,
It's-
will development in this space be more likely if it's all residential?
Well, I would say likely based on just conversations we've had with different developers. Again, you all are familiar with Slade. He's brought a number of items through the commission, and we get quite a few applications from him. We are looking for all sorts of opportunities for residential infill development, and this area being vacant and historically in use as residential, while the zoning doesn't reflect that, would be a great opportunity for someone to come in and take advantage of some of these vacant lots.
Process to rezone that entire plot from private industrial. Is it a lengthy process?
So it would, no, I would have to speak with our legal department on how it would look here in St. Joe. It was a standard rezoning that was lengthier in the sense that it was larger. So the notification boundaries were larger. The discussions we had to have with owners was also in addition to that process. So we would send out notifications saying your property is being considered for a city initiated rezoning, and we are moving it through that process. Here's why we are doing it. Here is why it would be a good option for you. By and large, residents were very appreciative of that, especially going from industrial to residential. The only time we ever ran into some issues in St. Joe specifically were individuals who had really enjoyed being able to plop something industrial on their property that doesn't make sense for it. And they would sometimes opt out of that, which was their right as the property owner. But other than that, it operated as a standard rezoning application. It would go through the planning commission and city commission, and the map would be changed. There may be other avenues for us to go down for that, but that is the process we took in St. Joe to make sure it was as transparent and open to public comment as possible.
I mean, I don't want to hold up this person's application, but I'm just thinking in terms of this space, it's very much a spot zone, and maybe that needs to be something we look at.
I'll let Zach correct me. I appreciate what you're bringing to this. It is bordered on one side by residential zoning.
That's true.
So it's not. I mean,
Yeah,
I think the other thing would be that a city-initiated rezoning is, at least in sort of, I think, the public imagination, a different beast than one that's an outside or a property owner applicant. But it's certainly open to it.
I will say one of the reasons we started those initiated rezonings in St. Joe was a massive flooding event that occurred on the south side of the city, and people were not able to rebuild their homes, and that is what pushed us to find that solution and take that on over my 2 years while I was there. We have been fortunate that we haven't had any real crazy issue like that to service that, but that was one of the ways that what could sometimes be perceived as city overreach or something was very much accepted by the community. And, again, we had opportunities to explain that within our notifications and things of that nature, but there was definitely a bit more fire under people to kind of see those through.
sure.
Here, it's definitely something we can explore. Ottawa doesn't have a ton of incongruent zoning to begin with, so kind of piecemealing it is not ideal, but we can definitely explore those options. For this particular application, like Lucas said, there is adjoining residential, and I think the historical context of the property, while again, it meets kind of the definition of spot zoning in the most basic sense of it being an outlying zoning district in a block face that is different, once you have the context of the property, I think it is a little bit more acceptable.
Anyone else?
I personally don't have an issue with the rezoning it to residential. However, what does concern me is the fact that not maybe this particular group of individuals here, but this department has already denied one person the same request in the past. And I can't see that anything has really changed. And I have a problem going along with the fact that it was denied not too long ago. What'd you say, 15 years ago?
Not
maybe?
even that, probably
even
in
that.
the last, sometime right before the pandemic.
And now it's okay. And I'll combine that with another conversation that Zach and I had about a possible spot zoning where it was indicated that you were veering away from doing spot
Yes,
zoning.
and on that particular instance, there was an increase in intensity. It was going from a residential potentially up to a commercial or industrial in an area that was already also built out. So that is a bit of a different situation, and it's possible that the context of the previous application maybe didn't reflect the historic nature of the area, what was built there. That's the thing, is I can't quite say
Right.
what full discussion was had at that time. I'd have to go back and find the minutes for that, but that is something that may not have been a part of that conversation or just wasn't in the mix. I would need to find out more about what happened with that specific discussion.
And in all likelihood, nobody that's on this current board was probably involved in that in any way, shape, or form. But we still represent the same. And I don't want to get called out and saying, hey, you guys denied me, but now you're letting him.
I think that's a
It
valid
is-
concern,
that's-
and we would need to find out what the reasoning was behind that initial denial. Again, that area is vacant, as we have seen, and the use that is there is existing residential. So why it would have been denied however many years ago when this was an opportunity to convert an area into developable land for residential purposes.
It was land that has the house.
I was
on
going
it.
to say,
Yeah, it has a
I think
house.
you're missing.
Oh,
What
it was the
happened?
house.
Yeah.
There was a house that a person built without a loan, and they went to sell that house, and the buyer could not get a loan because it was on an industrial.
Yep.
Right,
And so,
So are we talking about the property slightly north?
slightly north.
So
yeah.
the one that
It-
does have the existing house
It's
on
like
it.
it's 115.
street.
Yeah.
across the
Okay.
street.
So got
Yeah.
that. So
So
that
they,
is.
they tried to get it rezoned before they sold,
I-
and then they couldn't get it rezoned.
We'll keep my individual thoughts about that to myself. That does not seem like good planning practice when it is directly inhibiting somebody from being able to maximize the use of their property and creating nonconformities for the sake of a nonconformity. I do not agree with that from a planning perspective. So I will say that just does not seem to have been properly thought through.
From our perspective, I think it would certainly appear much better on us if we did what Brian mentioned, do the whole area as residential. Is that what you were indicating?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's fairly undeveloped property, has light industrial and hasn't been developed in
Sure.
50 years, right? So,
And that is a process we can explore. Again, that's more of a discussion we would need to have as a department with administration on how we would even approach that. For the purposes of this application, we are leaning on the historical context of the area and what the specific request is. And again, one of the factors that is contributing to the recommendation is the fact that it is a zoning request to a lesser intensity. It's going from industrial, which allows fairly intriguing mix of uses, to residential, which is obviously fairly limited to residential uses there. Not to say someone can
and that's
have
why I
a,
inquired about the timeline, because the timeline is similar for changing that whole area.
it was in St. Joe, and that's the thing
Okay.
is
It would not be at this point though, because we published for a public
Yeah.
hearing.
This is
Yeah.
just for this property,
Yes.
which,
Okay.
which is, I don't have an issue with that. I'm just thinking down the line, maybe we need to think about that, the rest of those adjacent properties.
absolutely. And the timeline again, yeah, it did follow basically the same timeline as a rezoning. However, that was our process that we were able to do. That may not necessarily be the same for every community.
Commissioner Crowley?
And what's on the north side of the block?
Largely vacant, a mix of industrial uses.
That's what I
You're
was
talking about
thinking. There
north
is
of East
industrial.
First.
No, I'm talking about in this block, on the
Oh.
north side of this block that you're not
there's
showing on the
something
drawing.
industrial.
I was thinking there was a shop there. and a
There,
couple
that's
other
the
things,
kind of warehouse shop I was trying to communicate. It's at the north end at the corner.
And we would affect that property if we did rezone, right?
Potentially. Now, that is one that could potentially be, depending on what the specific use is, I would need to check what the actual specific use is. It could be downzoned to a commercial, which corner commercials are fairly common. That's not an inappropriate thing to have at a junction of a street. First Street's a fairly important road. That's not anything too out of the ordinary. But if we do look at a larger area, that would be something to consider, because while it's not, again, a heavy industrial area or a very commercial area, some of those uses that have been there for a while were permitted in that area, and that would be something to consider. And we did that as well in our previous rezonings I did in my other community, and we just either excluded them altogether or coordinated with the owners on some form of other zoning that may be more appropriate for the area. Again, by and large, this is not a heavy industry part of town. It's a few blocks that way. We know that it's mostly a mixture of pretty straightforward residential uses, some public. We have the park. We have a few utility uses down that way as well. But other than that, it did not quite develop to a large
Mr.
industrial
Maxwell, you
park.
wish to weigh in?
Yeah, I think it's apparent from what I'm hearing that we're prepared to support the idea of the rezoning for this lot, but it's also apparent from what I'm hearing that we're prepared to look at options with regard to the area to make this kind of discussion not necessary downstream.
I think it would be a good option to explore. Again, now that is more of a, we would need to find out some specific processes on that end. So I can't tell you quite what that looks like, but it would be something to check out.
To put it bluntly, I don't want to be accused of playing favorites.
I'm kind of curious to know what the reasoning was. If you could look at the previous rezone across the road, it does surprise me that the city would have affected the sale of a property that was already a residential lot. I don't. Do you remember?
My recollection was that the city commission overruled the planning commission. Was my recollection, because the property did change hands.
Mhm.
So I don't know whether it changed hands through some other type of financing or whether it changed hands because of so I agree, we need to figure out what happened there, but the property deed did transfer.
If I remember correctly, we went ahead and transferred, but there was no financing required when it transferred.
And that may very well be. It may have
Cash
been
sales, so it
cash
wasn't
sale.
an issue.
Yeah, so, but if you'd look into that, what it's zoned now,
Mm-hmm.
and because we would, if it's still zoned industrial, we'd want to,
That whole block is still industrial.
well, no, but I say if that property is still industrial, then we'd want to include it, obviously include it. And I have no heartburn with what happened 15 years ago, because almost the entire, if not all of the city commission has changed, all of the planning commission has changed, and all of the staff has changed. So we have a different philosophy now, which is trying to grow the housing in the community. And
Yeah, needs have changed.
yeah, needs have
Yeah.
changed. And so, yeah, but I would say, and tell me if you concur with this or not, all of you. We need to put this, I don't know that we need to put it on the front burner, but we certainly don't want to put it on the back burner to look at rezoning all the rest of it. I think we'd like to have, before the year's out, we'd like to have a report, or we'd like to have some action started to get that all rezoned. Is there anybody that,
No, I agree. I
agree.
think if we get it rezoned to residential, I think we're gonna see some more.
yeah, and I think that's a great place for development, so, okay. Anything else on that one? All right, well, we'll look forward to the 26th.
Nice use of a Sanborn map. Always nice to see one of those get popped out.
I was looking around. I was like, I have this big book of maps in my office, and I just started flicking through it and seeing
Yep.
it for this purpose to see what was there 100 years ago. It was houses. So
Some of them probably didn't have to be cleared in 1957. Some of them probably just floated away.
Well, that is a 50 and 51. Yeah, that's true.
For
That is
51, I
true.
mean,
Mhm.
not 57.
It floated
57
away.
was fine.
Voted away in 51, and when did the levy start? That would have been the rest of them getting cleared.
59.
59.
59.
Yeah, and they did buy out a lot of that
Yeah,
area
they
at
did.
that point.
They did. And I can understand why, At that time, they would have probably rezoned it resident or industrial. But the reality of industrial now is you're not going to find any industrial. It's going to go in a 25 by 135 foot lot. They're going to want 7 acres, 10 acres, 15 acres anyway.
Not even mentioning like the parking
So-
aspect of it, the different types of requirements you have to have in an industrial use versus resident. Yeah, there's a lot there that street is just not appropriate for that.
Right. Okay. So old business. Do we have any old business?
I don't think so.
New business? Staff comments?
Thank you for making quorum. Always appreciate your participation and your very valuable input. And we still have a seat open. So
Yes, let's try to fill that last one. Commissioner comments? Well, if we hadn't had the discussion, which by the way was good discussion, this would have been the shortest meeting on record.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for lunch.
yes, thank you for lunch, much appreciated. We'll expect better next, steak, I like mine medium to medium rare. Okay, all right. Announcement, September 11th, 2024, Planning Commission meeting at 7 p.m. September 26th, 2024, Planning Commission meeting at noon. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?